بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. الحمد لله رب العالمين وأفضل الصلاة والتسليم على سيدنا محمد وعلى آله وأصحابه أجمعين. أما بعد. Actually, I'll begin with just addressing or reminding everyone that it's very difficult to be topical on a session-by-session basis because we're going through a text. So I know it would be great to know what we might be covering today, but we're going to go with what Imam Hasbi covers in the next piece of text that we're going to read. And obviously the nature of a lot of classical texts is that, I mean, there is some order in it, but often it's an articulation, right, of different aspects of spirituality. But there can be some. So, for example, we're early on in the text, so there is some discussion about some of the basic ideas around clarity in the Quran, what is clearly halal, what is clearly haram, followed on up with the discussion around intention. And usually intention is one of the first things that's discussed whenever we talk about any issue, really. But generally speaking, it can sometimes appear as though, it can sometimes come across almost as if it's a talk. The text can almost read like this could be somebody's talk on spirituality, right? And like in a talk, there can be an element of going from one topic to another. But again, the nature of the halaqah is to discuss the text and to use the text as a basis for bringing in wider issues. So I'm just going to carry on. If you have the English, it's page 13. That's where we're going to continue from. Or rather the matan, the text. In the translation in Imam Zayd's book is from page 13, and in the Arabic it's from the line وَإِنَّمَا يُمَيِّزُ ذَلِكَ وَيَخْلُقُ فِيهِ أَهْلُ الْعَقْلِ عَنِ اللَّهِ. Okay? So just very quickly, so last week the text spoke about our duty to the Quran, and the way it continues on now, it's as if to demonstrate that if we fulfill our duties to the Quran, then we already have clarity with regards to what we are supposed to do and not do. But that requires in order to achieve that clarity, in order to have clarity, particularly clarity that informs or that might inform action, it requires something else inside, something in the batin. That's really what he's speaking about now. So, having spoken about the duties of the Quran and ending with the verse, Allah is the loyal friend of those who believe. He takes them out from darknesses into light. He continues on by saying, وَإِنَّمَا يُمَيِّزُ ذَلِكَ وَيَرْغَبُ فِيهِ أَهْلُ الْعَقْلِ عَنِ اللَّهِ الَّذِينَ عَمِلُوا فِي إِحْكَامِ الظَّاهِرِ وتنزهوا عن الشبه. قال رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم الحلال بين والحرام بين وبين ذلك أمور مشتبهات تركها خير من أخذها. And only the people of intelligence and understanding, only people of understanding of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala are able to discern that. And he's referring to what was discussed before, and discerning the different obligations to the Quran in terms of believing in that which is ambiguous and practicing that which is clear and so on. So only those who have understanding of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, or are people of understanding of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, are able to discern that and desire it. And these are people who work to realize or actualize the apparent, meaning the apparent meaning of the Quran. What is apparently coming across from the word of the Quran? What the Quran is obviously and overtly trying to tell us. And they refrain from doubtful matters or things that might have a degree of lack of clarity in them, or things that might even cause doubt. Right? Their tendency, their quality is that they refrain from such things. And then he cites the hadith of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. The Messenger of Allah sallallahu alaihi wasallam said that the halal is clear and the haram is clear, and between them are matters that are ambiguous. And then he says, he stops the hadith citation there, which is the hadith continues. It's part of a longer hadith, and he says, "Tarkuha khayrun min akhdhiha." Abandoning those ambiguous matters is better than adopting them. Meaning, making ambiguous matters the basis of one's action is not a good thing, but rather the basis of one's action, one's amal, what one does, how one practices one's faith, should be those things that are clear in the Sharia. In the context of this hadith, he's speaking of the halal and the haram. Okay. Now, there's quite a few things to unpack here, so I'll try and go over them, inshallah. So, firstly, what does he mean by? Or let's not. Sometimes it's useful to avoid trying to read into the mind of the author too much. So let's just say people who understand Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Right? So what does it mean to understand Allah? And here, one important part of understanding Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is to understand Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in relation to ourselves, and to understand what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala wants from us. And the reason why he has said this in the context of clarifying what our duties are to the Quran is to really tell us that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is our Lord. We are his servants, his slaves, his creation. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala wants that relationship manifested. And the way he wants that relationship manifested is through devotion to Allah, servitude to him, and obedience to him. And that doesn't sound particularly complicated, right? Because he starts off by saying, only those who understand Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala are able to discern that. So, and it's easy to kind of explain it in those terms, but it's not so easy to implement it and to actualize it. Because what we're basically saying is, people who understand Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala understand that their job is to act as a servant, right? Their job is to act as one who is worshipping Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, submitting to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and is showing obedience to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And therefore, their concern is what? With that which is clear. Because it is only in matters of clarity that obedience is clear. It is only in matters of clarity that disobedience is clear. If we are particularly interested in what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala wants of me, then that is a sign that we're interested in obedience, that we're interested in servitude, that we're interested in worshipping Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. That doesn't require a great deal of philosophy and science. Science in terms of figuring out, interpreting things and looking at layers of meaning and so on and so forth. Those may well be things that people might intellectually ponder upon. But as far as our duty to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala goes, our dutifulness exists within the clear. It exists within within the clear command of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, because there the requirement is clear, which is, do and we do, don't do and we avoid. Right? Whatever that may be, whether it is salah, zakah, or spirituality and so on. And much of the Quran is that, as we discussed last week, right? That there are these clear verses in which what Allah wants from us is obvious. And that is the majority of the book. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says that as for those in whom there is crookedness, they seek the ambiguous. They seek the ambiguous, meaning they kind of, their religiosity lies within the ambiguous rather than the clear. So part of knowing Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is knowing that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala wants us to base our action on that which is clear, and serve Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala with that clarity. And the clarity is the clarity of obedience and servitude. And therefore, الَّذِينَ عَمِلُوا فِي إِحْكَامِ الظَّاهِرِ, like they work to actualize the apparent meaning of things. Is, well, obviously they will do that because they want to show obedience, and therefore they seek clarity, because without clarity obedience is difficult, and they're seeking out obedience because they understand who Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is. Did you want to say something?
I don't know what the format is. Am I allowed to interrupt you and ask a question?
Do you want to go on then? Go on.
I only have one. I was trying to listen to it and I'm a bit tired. Sorry for my clumsiness. I don't understand. If it's clear, why would there be ambiguity? The notion of ambiguity is when something's not clear, there's something else. So that seems a contradiction to me.
Well, I suppose there is a degree of clarity in the ambiguity, in that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is clearly telling us that some of it is unclear and some of it isn't. So that much is clear, right? And I think once that much is clear, the idea is there is no doubt that and I'll speak about different types of ambiguity. There is no doubt that the ambiguity is there. But the idea is that once a person understands Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and the relationship with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and that the relationship is based on servitude and obedience, they focus on the clear, right, as the basis for action. And by action, I mean, our amal in worship, our action in worshipping Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in all the different facets of life, whether it is direct worship through salah and so on, or whether it is worshipping Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala by serving His creation. Whichever it is, the majority of the commands of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala are clear in that regard. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is also clear that there are aspects of His revelation, and there are aspects of what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has said to us that may have ambiguities, irrespective of those ambiguities are objective or subjective, meaning that there may be some ambiguities that are actually unknowable, so they're objectively ambiguous. And there may be things that are subjective, meaning that it's not clear to you or I or me, but clear to another. So the point, though, is that there is sufficient for a person to recognize Allah as Lord, and for them to manifest their position as Allah's servant and do what the requirements of that are. That is easy because of the fact that the majority of the revelation of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala clearly tells us what we are required to do. But there is a crookedness in mankind that causes it to spend too much time and energy on the ambiguous. And this pretty much is a warning regarding that. I think if there was no, I think it would be a lot more difficult and confusing if there was no acknowledgement in the Quran that there were verses that were difficult that were perhaps the reality of their meaning is difficult to achieve or to arrive at, either for everyone, so it's objectively ambiguous. Like, for for example, let's just use that alif lam mim example, right? So perhaps, generally ulama, there's a broad consensus that we don't know what they mean because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has chosen not to tell us what they mean. And we accept that they're ambiguous, right? And there is no, given that the majority of the Quran is clear, there is no benefit in seeking out that ambiguity. That can be a problem if Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala hasn't acknowledged those verses. He hasn't acknowledged that there can be these places of ambiguity. But He has. That much is clear. So what is the requirement? What then is the requirement for us to do? That bit is also clear. Allah saying, well, it is crookedness to seek out, to pursue the ambiguous at the expense of what is clear, because what is clear is telling you what you must do. Okay, so anyway, so that's the point. Now, why there's ambiguity and where there is ambiguity, or there are different aspects of it. There are different aspects of ambiguity. So there were two examples we discussed yesterday, last week. In fact, three. One was these ambiguous letters. The other was verses that refer to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's, the verses that are attributing some sort of physical attribute, like a limb, like a physical limb to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, that are difficult theologically to consolidate and make sense of. And I spoke about that in those issues there were three different positions. There were three different positions that at least Sunni scholars took. And I mentioned at least my inclination that all three of them are valid ways of engaging with those verses. But even within those ambiguous verses, there is a clarity. And I always find that it's useful to point that out. So for example, so like if you play this out in reality, right? So in Surah Al-Fath, when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is speaking about the Treaty of Hudaybiyah, He speaks about the people who are pledging allegiance under the treaty. إِنَّ الَّذِينَ يُبَايِعُونَكَ تَحْتَ الشَّجَرَةِ إِنَّمَا يُبَايِعُونَ اللَّهَ يَدُ اللَّهِ فَوْقَ أَيْدِيهِمْ. Indeed, those who pledge allegiance to you under the tree, they are pledging obedience to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Allah's hand is above their hand. Now, if I ask you, do you think that verse is clear to you, what that verse is saying? Clear? It's pretty clear, right? If you didn't want to dwell on any particular detail of that verse, the context is clear. It's speaking about a pledge of allegiance under a tree. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is saying that He is that them pledging to the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam is as though they are pledging allegiance to Allah. And then Allah says Allah's hand is above their hand. That is also clear. However you understand, when you hear me say those words in English, although really the true manifestation of this conversation would be in Arabic, right? But let's say we're having a conversation in English. Let's just say it was revealed in English, and the words were Allah's hands above their hands, right? Even in English, to some extent, even in English idiom, instinctively, you know what that means. That it has something to do with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala being with them, Allah's assistance being with them. The context of the verse is consistent with that understanding. There is a word in there. If one dwells upon it, there can be theological implications around attributing the limb, hand, the body part, the hand to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. But isn't it possible to read the verse and understand the verse and just carry on? Because it seems clear what the verse is trying to say. and the context within which the verse is saying that. Right? However, a massive theological issue has erupted around the expression Allah's hand, or rather that word, Allah's hand. And people have fallen over that word and have asked questions around, well, what does that mean? Okay? And people have gone into, okay, well, Allah is clearly mentioning the word hand, so it must have a meaning. And if it has a meaning, what is that meaning? Does it mean Allah has a hand? Or is this metaphorical? Or is there some other interpretation? And so they dwell, and they differ. And it turns into this massive theological issue that really has nothing to do with the context of the verse. The verse is saying what it wants to say. And this is a very good example of how a verse that actually is clear, this verse is muhkam. It's a clear verse, it's clear in terms of what it is saying in that story, in the story of the Pledge of Allegiance in Hudaybiyah, right? But people have kind of obsessed over that one word, and that and yes, those perhaps those theological questions are necessary just because of the nature of man, that mankind is curious, and out of curiosity that question pops up. But it's interesting, isn't it, that the Sahaba didn't ask that question. There isn't any record that the companions of the Prophet ﷺ asked that question, what does the hand mean? And nor is there any record that the Prophet ﷺ sought to explain the implication of that verse as an attribute of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And hence you have a clear difference between people who were interested in what the verse was trying to say and people who later, out of their curiosity, for whatever reason, brought up the issue of the hand, which turned into a massive theological debate. Now, I don't want to accuse theologians of crookedness, of course, but if no one ever brought up the question of what the word hand in that verse means, we would have lost nothing. Does that make sense? Now there are, and in that, and along that, in that vein, there are many examples in the Quran of where what the verse is trying to say, that the meaning of the verse as a whole is clear, right? But people have obsessed over a word, right? And in that limited scope of mutashabihat or ambiguous verses that refer a link to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, you can see how there can be two different approaches. One approach is the one that Imam al-Muhasibi is describing here, which is the approach of those who know Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and are interested in realizing that which is clear, actualizing that which is clear, which is the verses praising the people who are pledging allegiance to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala under that tree. End of. Clear. And others who want to obsess over that word. There is a clear difference in approach between the two. Okay? And there are other examples of that. Some examples, which I will speak about in a minute, will can relate to everyday life, can speak to us, our everyday religiosity and spirituality in a profound way. Yes? Did you want to follow up, sister?
Sorry, I don't know if you take questions.
Go for it. I'm taking it. I'm taking it. So since I've engaged your question, I'm going to take it.
Thank you. That's why I'm grateful. I'm trying to understand it. So you're talking about metaphorical. What are the three Sunni position on that? Because you're talking about contextual, metaphorical, literal. But isn't it about the intentionality versus the form that it takes and the meaning of the form? That's a debate, or am I?
Well, so again, we can go into whether there's metaphor in the Quran, whether there isn't metaphor in the Quran, whether verses are always to be taken literally, etc., etc. But if we were to just stick to the idea, if we just stick to the principle and the context in which this is being discussed, which is that the requirement of the Quran, the requirement of our relationship with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, is to serve Him, worship Him, and to obey Him. And that is what we are to seek out. Then in that context, all of these conversations, although in their own space are important, become irrelevant. Does that make sense? So perhaps a legitimate way to approach these things, should our curiosity take us in that direction, and should then, or even, and to be fair, this is the case, even the necessity of theological challenges, if you like, to the Quran, or in the necessity of having to engage apologetics when they come up, polemics when they come up, should that take us that way? It should not be at the expense of the clarity of our relationship of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and what that relationship requires of us. There are two separate aspects, right? So I'll tell you this other thing, and then I want to move on, right? There is this big controversy around theology being tainted, if you like, for want of a better expression, being tainted by Greek philosophy, Hellenistic philosophy, and that giving rise to the science of kalam, ilm al-kalam. So ilm al-kalam, in simple terms, the most innocent way to put that in English is ilm al-kalam is theology, is Islamic theology, right? However, it's no longer so straightforward because it became controversial, and particularly the influence of Greek philosophy upon it and the discussions that brought up became the point of criticism, right? And some of our household names among the early scholars are on record to have openly criticized ilm al-kalam, or the people of kalam, the mutakallimun as they're known. But then people have commented on this, and scholars have tried to explain the context of that criticism. And I'm not going to go into it, but one example that I read was trying to explain Imam Shafi'i's criticism of the people of Kalam and Imam Abu Yusuf's criticism. Both are on record to criticize people of Kalam. Imam Abu Yusuf is Imam Abu Hanifa's student, right? Now, and an example is cited of people who engage in philosophical debates and in ilm al-kalam for decades with no concern for Sharia, no concern for discussions around halal and haram, and perhaps not particularly interested in how halal and haram impacts upon their own lives, how the question of simple things like being punctual in salah, and how things like building one's character and spirituality impact upon oneself. None of that is of interest. There is an obsession with these issues and these discussions. And center stage within these discussions are these issues. Issues around, what does hand mean with reference to Allah? What does face mean with reference to Allah? Does Allah have a face? Doesn't He have a face? And all of these issues, these became massive theological obsessions, right, in early communities. And there were people who were obsessed with them so much that they weren't interested in the other side. I think that's the point. That's the point, that those things may have a relevance in a particular context, but the Muslim's duty is to focus on the clear. And the clear tells us what to do. Clear tells us what to do. Okay? And for the most part, the majority of people don't need to even think about it. But how many Muslims think about this question of what the word hand means with reference to Allah? How many people read the translation of that verse and think about that? They don't. But it's an issue that the Ummah has obsessed over for a millennium. Okay? And that's important. That to make that point is important for the sake of our spirituality and for the sake of our ability to obey Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala as Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala wants us to obey Him. Now, with reference to the hadith of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, al-halalu bayyinun wal-haramu bayyin, this hadith that the halal is clear and the haram is clear. Here, I think that there's something that I want to clarify. I don't know if I should, but okay. So, halal is something that Allah has permitted. Something that Allah has permitted. And the haram is something Allah has forbidden. Clearly, scripturally. Right? Meaning that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has made it clear in scripture that something is halal, or made it clear in scripture that something is haram. Now, the interesting thing about this is that the halal, although it appears, from what I've just said, it sounds like, oh, it's clear. It's clear, but it's open. It's clear, but it's open. And what I mean by that is Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala didn't take it upon Himself to list for us all of the things that are halal. There's no such thing in the Quran, right? Often, in certain contexts, we understand something is permissible in contrast to something that Allah has clearly forbidden. Okay? And therefore, often the halal is clear, not because there is a list of all that is halal, but rather the halal is clear because the haram is clear. Does that make sense? And there's a verse where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala lists some examples of things that are haram, saying that only these things are prohibited, as if to limit the haram to a few things, right? And leave the halal open. Leave the halal open. And it's based on verses like that the fuqaha came up with the principle that outside of the domain of worship, where the Sharia is somewhat prescriptive, right? The rule is that any matter that isn't clearly prohibited is permissible. Anything that is not clearly prohibited is permissible. And therefore, knowing what is permissible is simply a question of knowing what is prohibited. If you know what's prohibited, if you have knowledge of what is prohibited, then you know what isn't, and therefore you know what is permissible. And in that sense, there is a word for it which is known as mubah. Right? Mubah. And mubah is something that is value neutral, meaning you can just do it. Right? Can I sit here? Well, of course you can. Right? Can you sit there? Yes, you can. It's mubah. The question, you don't even need to ask the question. You even know instinctively that it's fine. Because there is no reason for you to think that it isn't permissible. Right? Something you might think something is impermissible only because it now has some sort of connection to the haram, or it's triggered something in your mind that you think is impermissible. So really, your understanding of what is permissible is directly connected to what you know that is impermissible. Okay? And really, Islamic jurisprudence is essentially an explanation of that which is halal and that which is haram. In between, there are things that are mushtabihat. So the hadith continues, وَبَيْنَهُمَا, between them there are things that are mushtabihat. And the hadith continues with an analogy actually. in which the Prophet ﷺ goes on to say, like the shepherd who is whose flock is grazing around a forbidden pasture. كالراعي يرعى حول الحمى. It's possible because his flock is around forbidden pasture that one of them might stray into the forbidden pasture. Okay? And therefore it's best that that forbidden pasture is clearly avoided. That one keeps a little distance from it so that you don't end up. Yeah? So, it's like, you park on a double yellow. That's already forbidden, but anyway. But you park on it, you're thinking, oh, maybe I won't get a ticket. Well, you put yourself at risk. Now, practically, one of the juristic forms of the ambiguous are things that are classed in Sharia, legally classed as makruh or disliked. Now, there's a reason why things are declared makruh. One is because there's a hadith that declares it makruh, that says it's disliked. But a more common reason is because it isn't clear. It's not clear that it is haram. Does that make sense? Meaning that the fuqaha have tried to be as clear as they can with regards to things that are haram. When they couldn't, because they felt that textually the evidence wasn't clear enough, or because the text doesn't mention it, meaning there isn't a direct or indirect prohibition. So direct prohibition is Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has mentioned it in the Quran. This is haram. Usually is haram. Indirect, Allah hasn't mentioned it clearly in the Quran, but there is a principle in the Quran that this issue is violating. The principle doesn't spell out this particular thing, but it is the principle that this issue can come under that principle. And here you end up in the domain of interpretation. Okay? And this often happens with new things that come up that are considered harmful. That perhaps in the era of in early Islam, or in the era of revelation, meaning when revelation was coming down, when the Quran was being revealed to the Prophet, these things didn't exist. Okay, so a common example is like something like smoking. And don't ask me any questions about smoking. I'm just giving you an example, all right? So there's no verse in the Quran that says cigarettes are haram. There's no hadith that says cigarettes are haram. There was no such thing as cigarettes back then. However, when it became clear that cigarettes are harmful, right? Other verses that principally prohibit harming oneself, لا تقتلوا أنفسكم, do not destroy yourselves, right? لا تلقوا بأيديكم إلى التهلكة, right? Do not subject yourselves to destruction. These types of verses were used to say this should be impermissible because doing this thing is subjecting oneself to harm, right? Or to destruction, and therefore one should avoid it. However, fuqaha particularly, and here actually I won't mention the differences between the fuqaha because it will complicate things. But here the fuqaha have looked at this and said, you know what? Because there's no clear mention of this item, this product, cigarettes, right? We won't say that it is haram because haram requires textual prohibition. But we will call it makruh. Okay? We'll call it makruh. And by makruh it means that it is disliked to the degree of prohibition, but the term haram can't be used. Because this is an interesting way of understanding this hadith, because al-halalu bayyin. Because the Prophet said, that halal is clear. And if something isn't textually clear, we can't call it haram. So the Hanafis in particular, among the juristic schools, refrain from calling something haram if it's not mentioned in Quran and Hadith. If it isn't clearly prohibited in Quran and Hadith. Does that make sense? Now, let's get a bit more ambiguous. You are subjectively doubtful about something. So you're in a situation where you're faced by something and you're wondering, can I do this? And you're confused about what to do because it's not clear. Now, it could be a situation where you're not sure because of a lack of information, right? Or it could be that you're unsure because of conflicting information. Yes? Right. These lines here in the text are giving us guidance on what to do, what is the better thing to do, what is the requirement of piety in that situation. Right? So I'll give you two examples. An example of being unsure because you have a lack of information is whether a product that you picked up is halal or haram, when nowadays, for example, when you go to the supermarket, a lot of Muslims rely on the suitable for vegetarian mark to kind of give themselves the satisfaction that there's no animal product in there. Okay? So me personally, when I think that there's a product that could have something like gelatin or something like that in it, or some sort of animal product in it, it could have it, meaning it's that type of product, but it doesn't have the suitable for vegetarians stamp on it, I kind of end up in this zone where I'm thinking, I'm not sure that it's haram. I'm not sure that it's got. I've got no evidence that there's something haram in it, but I have no evidence that there isn't, right? And obviously there are lines that are blurred around what companies are legally required to declare and not declare and so on. But at least the Vegetarian Society stamp gives me that degree of clarity that at least somebody's gone through the process of checking and saying, no, this has no animal products in it. Now I know that the only other thing I have to check is there alcohol in this product? And if it doesn't have that, khalas, it's halal. Yeah? So here, for me personally, in that situation, so if I'm unsure, it may well be that if I play probability and I say, yeah, most likely, it's okay, and I go ahead and I eat it, right? And it might turn out that it was halal. But the requirement of piety in that situation, and the people that are being described here, people who seek to actualize the clear, the requirement is to let it go. Is to not get that and to go with what's clear. Because there's probably another 10, 15 products on that shelf, right? I'm not going to die by not eating that product. There's another 10, 15 products on that shelf that have the suitable for vegetarian stamp on it that I can eat, right? Why would I buy this? So leaving that is a different example of what in real life may be a moment of ambiguity between the halal and the haram, right? And so on, right? And so on and so forth. There is a requirement, and sometimes when a person, like I said, it may well turn out that the product that didn't have the stamp on it was actually halal, right? So something that is ambiguous isn't necessarily haram, but what is the requirement of piety? That's what's being addressed here. What is the requirement of piety for the individual, for the sake of turning that moment of ambiguity into a moment of obedience, What do the people of obedience do? The people of obedience seek out the clear. Of course, one has to acknowledge that that's not always possible. That is not always possible. and which brings me to my last point. And my last point is that in everyday life, sometimes things are unclear because there's conflicting information. So here there was an absence of information, right, with that product. But sometimes there's conflicting information. And conflicting information is really complicated when it's coming from scholars. One says it's halal, the other says it's haram. Again, if one has no reason to have to use something that there's disagreement about, right? Then it goes without saying, this much is clear that avoiding the issue altogether is the higher station. Is the higher station. However, it may be that there is a need. It's medication. Ulama have a difference of opinion about it, but it's medication, and you need that medication. In those situations, because there are ulama who've given fatwa on either side, need can provide the clarity. Why? Because the Sharia addresses need. The Sharia addresses need and necessity. And need and necessity can provide that clarity. So although piety may dictate that you avoid, need can come in and provide clarity. I like to say that when it comes to matters of jurisprudence, for ordinary people, when need comes in, right, they can go with what they can proceed based on need and necessity if they feel they must. But if they don't need to, then again we go with the point of clarity, which is avoidance. Because avoidance gives you the clarity in that moment. I'm going to avoid it. And this much is clear. And there's lots and lots of examples of ulama telling us that piety lies in avoiding the ambiguity. That piety is in avoiding things that are ambiguous. Okay? And pious people generally will do. They will be extremely scrupulous when it comes to things that might be ambiguous, because they're very, very concerned about avoiding harm at all costs. Okay? Obviously, we've evolved into a situation now where people are deliberately and knowingly doing the harm. And in that situation, there are maratib, there are different people are in different places on the spectrum. There are people who do the haram, don't make tawbah. People who do haram make tawbah. There are people who avoid the haram, but in some situations where they'll take advantage of things regarding which ulama have difference of opinion, right? And there are very, very, very common examples of that. Okay, so whether it's particularly, and this really kind of it gets even more complicated when we're dealing with matters of leisure. We're dealing with matters of leisure outside of the domain of necessity. Okay, so music. Well, I might disagree about it. The majority say that it's impermissible. Some say that it is permissible. Early ulama who mentioned permissibility have mentioned it in certain contexts, etc., etc., etc. So here there is a point of ambiguity and there's difference of opinion, but it's outside of the domain of here. Need doesn't really inform us. Necessity doesn't inform us because it's not something of necessity. So again, what does a person do? And there is a dictate of piety. There's something that is a requirement of piety, and then there is something that people just do because it's a habit, or they want to, or they have their own personal reason. Yeah. So there's people who commit haram but make tawbah. Others who kind of will, they'll say, well, I'm not doing something that's haram because some ulama have given permission, so therefore I'm going to allow myself, or I'm going to allow my children, or I'm going to go ahead and enjoy this. So that's another position, that's another station. People who, and then there are people who might do things that are that are ambiguous, but they'll only do it sometimes, right? And then there are people who will indulge in the ambiguous. And then there are people who are at the other end of the piety spectrum, who will not only avoid the haram, but will entirely avoid ambiguities in all forms. Some people avoid ambiguities of the former type, but not of the latter type. And they'll avoid ambiguities when it comes to the food example that I gave. They'll be like, no way, absolutely not. But when it comes to things, more kind of leisurely aspects of life in which ulama have disagreed upon, they'll be like, oh, at least some ulama have given fatwa of permissibility. I'm going to go ahead and make my life a little bit more enjoyable and enjoy this. And they're different, actually, the people. And here, those are also two different points on the spectrum. For all of us, wherever we are, we're on a journey from that end of the spectrum to this end of the spectrum. Does that make sense? And most importantly, there's no need for people on different parts of the spectrum to judge others. Okay? So those things are important. And really, these types of ahadith are really speaking to the person. They're speaking to us individually as people who are required to be pious, people who acknowledge that I am required to be a person of taqwa. Yeah? Okay, sure. So, I hope that makes sense. So where I will make a clear distinction, I don't know if there was a clear, but where I will make a clear distinction is where things are ambiguous because of difference of opinion among ulama, but a person needs to do it out of some sort of necessity. I think here there's a clear distinction between that situation and situations where necessity doesn't exist. So when necessity doesn't exist, there is a test of piety. But when necessity exists, I do not believe that such situations should be treated as though they are a test of piety. Because I don't think they are. Why? Because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala doesn't require us to put ourselves into difficulty, to suffer as a result of deed. If a person does it, they can do it, they can suffer personally, but they cannot make that the norm. Right? I as a scholar shouldn't give fatwa requiring people, right, to forego their needs, to suffer where that suffering is avoidable because there is an opinion that can be used to avoid that suffering. Does that make sense? So one of the problems in the community is that people convolute those two issues. So where something of ambiguity or something of difference, something that's ambiguous because of difference of opinion, is engaged upon because of necessity. Sometimes extreme necessity, sometimes lesser degrees of necessity, but some degree of necessity that is convoluted and kind of bundled in with things that are much more leisure. Okay? And there's a difference. And a lot of this stuff is personal. So, which is where the hadith comes in, where the Prophet ﷺ tells people, or ask your heart. Make your heart your mufti. Make your heart the mufti and ask it. And see what your heart has to say about it. Right? Anyway, which then brings us to the next thing that Imam al-Muhasibi speaks about. So he says, فَافْحَصْ عَنِ النِّيَّةِ فَافْحَصْ عَنِ النِّيَّةِ وَعَرِفِ الْإِرَادَةِ فإن المجازاة بالنية قال رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم إنما الأعمال بالنيات وإنما لكل امرئ ما نوى. So therefore, seek clarity of intention. Ifhas, that word means examination. Examine your intention. So examining your intention is about seeking clarity in your intention. And know your will. Know what you want to do. Right? Know what your intention is. Know what your clear choice is, what you are choosing. Because reward is by action, by intention. And therefore, the hadith, Messenger of Allah sallallahu alaihi wasallam said, indeed actions are by their intentions, and indeed every person is rewarded according to what they have intended. Okay? How does that tie in with what we said all this time? A person who engages in something that is ambiguous but necessary for them, they need to do it. Their intention is very different to somebody who leisurely dabbled in things that are ambiguous. Intention is important, and much of piety is about intention. It's about examining intention and seeking clarity with regards to one's intention. Why am I doing it? Why do I want to do this thing? And again, just like why a person engages in something that is doubtful or ambiguous, just like that is very personal to the individual. Intention is also very personal to the individual. The two things come together, right? The two things come together completely. You can't separate them. So, I don't know, somebody might be engaging in something that is doubtful, that is ambiguous, doubtful, perhaps haram according to many scholars, because they have an addiction. They have an addiction that they're trying to tackle, right? And the way out of their addiction in something that is haram lies in them easing themselves out by doing things that are perhaps ambiguous. Does that make sense? But that decision is very, very personal to that individual. And it shouldn't be, and people shouldn't be pushed when it comes to things that they may be personally trying to deal with. Does that make sense? So, this thing is haram according to so and so and so and so and so and so is an off-cited statement by members of the community, brothers and sisters, saying it to one another to try to get somebody to stop doing something that they believe is wrong because the scholars they follow say it is wrong. Well, there are two issues here. One, this person may not even know who your scholars are. A complete unfamiliarity. So, like the Hanafi who eats prawns, right? Among the Hanafis, there is a disagreement about whether prawns are halal or not, or they're makruh tahrimi or not. With some believing that it's makruh tahrimi, and therefore you can't eat it, and others believing that it is permissible. So a person goes, oh, it's haram, etc., etc. But this person has been consuming all of his life, and doesn't know anything about these scholars who say it's haram. Does that make sense? And therefore, so all of this is about one's personal amal and where a person is themselves and how they have to manage their own piety by moving from haram perhaps to having their own reasons why they might be doing something that is ambiguous to then eventually ending up increasingly remaining within that which is clearly halal, clearly permissible. And here intention is a factor because intention is personal and a person's intention may be very, very legitimate. And sometimes intentions cannot be judged based on jurisprudence. Right? Intentions are very, very personal and they're between the servant and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Okay, then he says, وَالْزَمْ تَقْوَى اللَّهِ فَإِنَّ الْمُسْلِمَ مَنْ سَلِمَ النَّاسُ مِنْ يَدِهِ وَلِسَانِهِ وَالْمُؤْمِنَ مِنْ أَمِنَ النَّاسُ بَوَائِقَهُ قال أبو بكر الصديق رضي الله تعالى عنه اتق الله بطاعته وأطع الله بتقواه ولتخف يداك من دماء المسلمين وبطنك من أموالهم ولسانك من أعراضهم وحاسب نفسك في كل خطرة. So again, this is all about piety. So he says, and hold on to the taqwa of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Okay? For indeed, and this is a hadith, the Muslim is the one whose hand and tongue people are safe from. The Muslim is the one whose hand and tongue people are safe from. And the believer is the one whose offenses, there's lots of meanings of this word, but whose offenses other believers are safe from. Are safe from. Other believers. So other people. Right? So obviously here, Imam al-Muhasibi has deliberately chosen one version of this hadith that broadens the meaning, because there is another version of the hadith that mentions Muslims only. This version is also valid and authentic, but it mentions all people. And this hadith, it's interesting that he chose this hadith this version of the hadith back then. But this version of the hadith is very, very important for us, because generally the famous narration of this hadith is al-Muslimu man salim al-Muslimuna min lisanihi wa yadihi. That the Muslim is the one whose hand and tongue other Muslims are safe from, as though this is something that is between Muslims, and perhaps if it was a non-Muslim then it wouldn't matter. But there is a version, an authentic version of hadith that doesn't use the word Muslim but uses people, and therefore is referring to all people. So here Imam al-Muhasibi is kind of under the heading of taqwa, is speaking about matters that are to do with people's interaction with each other, people's dealings with one another. And it's interesting because there are many ulama in earlier times who actually define taqwa in this way. And there are those who even define worship in this way. That early Muslims didn't consider worship to be about fasting and prayer, but worship was about not harming other people. Because for them, fasting and prayer was a given. It was part and parcel of life. That they were way past not praying or having issues with regards to prayer. For them, achieving true piety was about protecting other people from harm. Okay? And Imam Muhasibi, when he speaks about taqwa, here in particular, he's just speaking about avoiding harming others. So there's this hadith. And then Abu Bakr, he quotes Abu Bakr as-Siddiq radiallahu ta'ala anhu as saying that have taqwa of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala by obeying him. The taqwa is obedience to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And obey Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala by having taqwa of him. Right? So have taqwa of Allah by obeying him, and obey Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala by having taqwa of him. And وَلْتَخَفْ يَدَاكَ مِنْ دِمَاءِ الْمُسْلِمِينَ, and may your hand, and let your hand fear violating the blood of Muslims, and your stomach from violating the wealth of Muslims, meaning don't consume the wealth of others in a haram way. And let your tongue fear from the honor of other Muslims. Okay? This is what is Abu Bakr as-Siddiq radiallahu ta'ala being quoted by Imam al-Muhasibi. So I just want to quickly say the simplest definition of taqwa is what we've been discussing until now. Ulama agree on this definition, that taqwa is so before without going into linguistically what it means, that taqwa is simply staying on the halal and avoiding the haram. That's taqwa. Simple as that. Linguistically, taqwa can mean fearing something and therefore avoiding it out of fear of it. And taqwa can also mean consciousness, being conscious of something. And the consequence is the same. Fear of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala results in avoidance. Consciousness of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala also results in avoidance of things that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has not permitted. The reason why it's so important to speak of taqwa and focus on dealings with people is because that is where the pious violate taqwa. That is where the pious end up at fault. Meaning people who perhaps are praying and consider their piety to be about their prayer and their worship and their fasting and their tahajjud and their tilawah of the Quran and their dhikr of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, their greatest danger is falling foul of taqwa by harming others. Either by backbiting them, or looking down upon other people by not deeming their taqwa to be up to their standard. This is the most common one. Somebody becomes practicing, the moment they become practicing, all of a sudden they're praying, etc., or whatever their own personal expression of taqwa is, right? It may be they weren't praying, now they are. They weren't concerned about halal and haram, now they are. They weren't wearing hijab, now they are. And then the first thing that they start to do is harm others by thinking ill of them. By thinking ill of them. And really not realizing that actually just yesterday, I was the same, and it is only by the grace of Allah and by the mercy of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala that I have changed. Okay, so that's why that danger is always there. And people always harm us. We always cause harm to others in some way or other, whether it is our spouses, whether it's our children, whether it's our neighbors, whether it's just, and we do it innocently. And in this culture, it's the norm. Right? Some of these things, there's no protection against some of these things. Abu Bakr as-Siddiq radiallahu anhu's statement, right? He's referring to the things that are protected in Islam. He's referring to the things that are protected in Islam. He's saying, let your hands fear violating the blood of Muslims, the wealth of Muslims, and the honor of Muslims. Right? Now, in the modern world, blood and wealth is protected. Meaning, if you harm somebody physically, right, then that is something that you can go to the police for. If you harm someone, if you steal something, if you take something that illegally, that's not yours, that is something that there's legal recourse. So you can go to the police about that. But if somebody harms your reputation, there's not much you can do, right? But in Islam, honor is important. A person's reputation is important. It is one of the protected aspects of every single person, right? It is more important, more valuable in the eyes of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, more honored and respected in the eyes of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala than the Kaaba, according to a hadith of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, in which he was going around the Kaaba and he was saying how glorious are you and how well respected are you, O Kaaba. He was talking to the Kaaba, and then he said, but by Allah, the honor and the blood of a believer is more respectable in the eyes of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala than you. Right? That their blood is violated, that their honor is violated. So I think this is an important takeaway, that for some people, salah is easy, fasting is easy, ibadah is easy, but this other part is really, really difficult. For other people, this part is easy, the other part is difficult. And it's because of that the Prophet ﷺ said that Jannah is attained by achieving two things. Right? So the Sahaba asked the Prophet ﷺ, what is the greatest cause in taking a person to paradise? And he said, taqwa Allah, the consciousness of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and good character. And I like to say that in common parlance, in most of our understanding, most of us associate taqwa with worship and acts of worship. And this other thing that is 50% of the story, which the other half of what takes people to paradise, is working on our character so that it never harms another. Right? Because it is a person's character, it is personality that ultimately is going to become harmless or harmful, right? And everybody they have a bit of both, and that's something that it's harder to work on than becoming punctual in salah, or even increasing one's worship. A person can increase one's worship but continue to harm other people, continue to harm people by having bad financial dealings and therefore violate their wealth, by being violent, pious but is violent family, to a spouse, to other people, has violent tendencies, or is pious in the sense of worship, um, but will backbite people and therefore will defame people, will attack people's reputation easily, right? You know, I once fell out with somebody, and he just couldn't understand why, and it was because he had said to me that someone else wasn't to be trusted, right? And I said, well, you have no reason to say that to me. Why would you say that to me? Why would you change my opinion of somebody else? So when he said that to me, I had when he said that to me, I had one simple question. I said, I need to see evidence. Show me, do you have evidence? And there was no evidence. I said, look, I'm sorry, but I'm going to avoid you, because why would you plant that thought in my mind about this other person without evidence? And it is for that reason, and it's because that is so important. That is such a big issue, and it's in Islam is considered to be such great harm upon another, that you change somebody's good opinion of a person into a bad one, that false accusations carry capital punishment. False accusations of sin carry capital punishment in Islam, because people's honor is protected. Just like wealth is protected, just like blood is protected. It's extremely important. And of course, this is a big issue with free speech. And you know that, kind of Muslims in the Islamic world, we tend to clash with the West on the question of free speech when it comes to attacking or undermining somebody else's honor. That's all for today.